Welcome into the Brookline.News podcast. I'm Sam Mintz, the editor of Brookline.News. We're an online, nonprofit local news outlet covering the town of Brookline. And I'm here with Jessica Smyser, who's the executive director of Brookline Interactive Group. And we're here to talk about the news.
Hi, Sam.
Hey, Jessica, how's it going?
Pretty well. The kids are back in school. It's a little bit more lively around here, we should say.
Before we get started, our podcast this week is sponsored by Amy Lipton Real Estate. Amy's a local resident and award-winning realtor at Coldwell Banker in Chestnut Hill. We'd like to thank Amy for being the first sponsor of this podcast. So Let's dive into the news.
Yay, exciting about a sponsor. All right, let's move into the news. First story we're going to talk about, the headline is, "In Brookline's weed economy, where sales are sinking and a store is closed, some see opportunity." Can you tell us a little bit about the current goings-on in the weed economy in Brookline?
Yeah, this was a really interesting sort of in-depth report by Celeste Alcalay, our excellent summer intern who I've mentioned on this podcast before. And we had talked about looking at, how are the 4 dispensaries in Brookline doing? There was a big hubbub when they first came to town in 2019. Netta was one of the first, or I think the first dispensary to open in the Boston area. There were a lot of people who wondered how they would do, what it would mean for the neighborhoods. And so we wanted to look at sort of the economic piece of this. How are they doing? And the news is mostly bad if you're someone who's trying to make money from one of these dispensaries. Our story sort of charts these declining sales really sinking over the last 5 or 6 years. One of the 4 stores has already closed within a couple of years. Another just changed ownership. So Celeste's story really dug into why do people think that's happening? What does it mean for the town, for the stores? And the short answer for why people think it's happening is just competition. There are hundreds more dispensaries than there were 5 years ago across Massachusetts. You don't have to travel to Brookline to get to a dispensary. You can go pretty much anywhere in the state and find somewhere that's selling cannabis.
Well, one of the numbers in the article that really stopped me in my tracks is the tax revenue number. And correct me if I'm wrong, but what it looks like is that in your article it says, or Celeste's article, I should say, that first year saw $1.84 million generated in local taxes. But in fiscal year 2024, it dropped from $1.84 million to $386,574. I mean, that's huge.
Absolutely. It's a nearly 80% decrease. And to be clear, this is the 3% local sales tax that goes to the town. So these are not anything like what the stores are grossing or anything, but this is what the town receives. And yeah, Celeste talked to some town administrator folks who said tax revenue is going way down to the town. We think it's based on competition. We think it's just, in 2019, if you wanted to buy cannabis at a retailer in the Boston area, when Netta opened, it was the only place you could go for miles and miles. That isn't the case, and it hasn't been for a number of years. So it's sort of a natural evolution. But if you're the people trying to run these stores, I think it's difficult and frustrating, and in some cases has proven unsustainable, basically.
Well, absolutely. And if you're the town trying to run a budget too, I mean, that kind of drop is kind of amazing, and probably they didn't predict it.
They might say they did. They might say they didn't. It's also, the tax revenue was being used in sort of specific ways, and in the scheme of the whole town budget, it's not a giant drop, but it is, more than $1 million less in revenue than there was 5 years ago. So I think it's a problem, maybe a small problem, but a problem for sure.
Well, and I also think your article does a good job of pointing out that there are independent owners at play here, but also chains. And so the competition consists of people who are locals who are running these stores, but also pretty large chains that are coming in and running stores, but they have sort of run into many of the same problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And the retailer that's featured most heavily in the story was ComAv Canna, the Hauk family that runs it. And so let's talk to them. And they're on ComAv right there by BU. In theory, an excellent place to have a cannabis dispensary. They had a competitor come in basically right next door that only lasted a year or two, and they just talked about the way that it was a struggle while Mission, the other competing dispensary, was next door, and then their sales soared again once Mission closed because it was having its own financial problems. So it's really delicate ecosystem, and in part because it's so regulated, there are grocery stores everywhere, so they do compete with each other. Their prices do matter to each other, but it's just such a different situation when it's this highly regulated, more controlled, increasingly common but less common resource. And one of the early stats that Celeste mentioned in the story that I thought was so interesting was about the price of marijuana. Basically, the average price of marijuana fell from roughly $15 per gram 5 years ago to $3.31 this
Wow.
April. Tough to keep making money at the same rate if you're in that business.
Well, the headline of the article also mentions opportunities. So, I mean, what are the biggest opportunities people are seeing?
Yeah, I think what that refers to is one that the Hauk family that Celeste talked to running Comav Canna is hopeful. They think they can survive and stay in business. They think that being local helps them. Also, that sort of the some of the public perception and criticism has softened a little bit. Was the sense that Celeste got in writing this story. She talked to some folks from the town who basically said, this is a quote from Gabrielle Dean, coordinator of the town's behavioral health and intervention program. Quote, I've been really surprised. It has become acceptable among older people to smoke weed and use cannabis, talking about hearing seniors in their 70s and 80s comparing flower quality between dispensaries. So the fact that there's these sort of new, like developing possible customer bases, I think was one area for hope and opportunity. And John Hauk from Calm Canna said that there's a Brookline-based clientele, he said, who tend to be a little bit older, looking for stuff to help them with pain or help them with sleeping. So I think that idea and that opportunity and hope is based on the fact that it's still a developing industry. People are still sort of learning about legal cannabis in Massachusetts, despite the fact that it's been a number of years now, and that there's still, the possibility to find new niches and client bases.
Yeah, I have to admit, I was sort of amused by the surprise that people in their 70s or 80s were talking about it because I was like, well, that's my parents' generation, and I know that they
Right?
know
How old were they in the
we didn't
60s?
invent it.
Yeah.
They're just getting it in a different way than they used to,
Yep.
and can talk about it in public. But I think it's really true that just overall, I guess not just perception, but the applications have expanded, right? People do think about it as a way to help with sleep. People do think about it as a way to manage pain in a way that maybe they didn't in the past. They thought of it as a more recreational thing. So yeah, there's definitely an opportunity there.
I think the marketing has changed a lot too. The use of edibles, and I think again though it's this 5 or 6 year old industry in Brookline is still very new, and it's just interesting that it's seen so much turnover in just its first 5 years. I think it's not super surprising, honestly, given the sort of volatility of the product and the controversy and the politics. A story we'll definitely want to watch as the years go by and as this industry in Brookline continues to change. I think there's word of another license shift. The one that closed, will there be a replacement? It won't be at the same address, but I know that the town is seeking a new applicant to replace Mission, which was the one that closed on ComAv. So there'll be yet another new dispensary potentially in the next year or two.
Well, yeah, despite the struggles, they're not going away, and I think we'll see what happens to this industry. It's very interesting. Thank you for this article. All right, the next story we're going to talk about is about low levels of toxic chemicals known as PCBs being found in soil during the Pierce School rebuild.
So this is a good story by our new environmental freelancer, Delaney Dreyfus, who dug in after, I passed along a tip to her that there had been these PCBs found in soil near the Pierce School. And just to make sure, it's clear at the top, like this is not something people necessarily should be very alarmed about. I think we tried to make that clear with our headline in our story. There's apparently no immediate harm to health or past direct harms to health. But I thought it was really interesting, sort of this idea that when you dig up a big site like the Pierce School, which is being rebuilt essentially on the same site, you don't know what you're going to find. And in this case, in the soil in this very specific area where there had been a 1960s parking garage ramp, they found these chemicals called PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, which are toxic and carcinogenic. They found them in very low levels, was the quote from the town's project manager. But it's still something very much worth keeping an eye on, I think.
What I understood from the article was that they think that the soil that contained these PCBs was actually brought in during a previous construction project. So it wasn't in the ground before, but during this project was trucked in from somewhere else.
Yeah, that's right. That's my understanding too.
Yeah, so I mean, it just brings to mind just this idea of where are people bringing soil in to do different things and to the continued testing. I was just impressed that they found it, that they're doing continued testing on things. I mean, I think that gave me some comfort to know that people continue to test for toxic substances in our soil.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are really strict requirements that go into a project like this from the state environmental protection agency. there's a expert quoted named Pang Gao, who's an assistant professor of environmental health and exposomics at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. The most interesting thing that Pang Gao said was that basically one of the biggest risks for children is eating dirt. It's sort of one of the ways that they can most often be exposed to these chemicals. So obviously, you don't want your kids eating dirt at all, but this is maybe another reason to be extra careful and make sure that lessons learned, that it's a not healthy thing to do.
Yes, I enjoyed that advisory. It said children should be discouraged from eating dirt. Yes, and
Agreed.
also agree with that. And also, careful hand washing practices should be followed. So, if we've learned nothing over the past 6 years or so, we should learn to make sure that everybody washes their hands. All right, then the last story we're going to talk about, a really nice story about a new local business. Bocadillos, a love letter to the empanada, opens on Cypress Street.
Yeah, everybody loves a food story. I've learned that as the editor of Brookline.News. Our stories that really get people most excited and are often most read are about new restaurants. So this is about Bocadillos, which opened on Cypress Street, not too far from where we are at Brookline High School, just a few months ago. It features empanadas. It's by Kennedy Lavore, who had run a pop-up called the Nada Cart for several years and recently bought this brick and mortar space on Cypress Street. Still serving empanadas at farmers markets and catering corporate events, but also really settling into this new space. And I thought, Kennedy's story was really interesting. This was by Selena Colby, who's a freelance reporter for us. They serve at least 6 different types of empanadas, like La Cubana, which is like a Cuban sandwich, the Argentina, which has ground beef and potato. I'm getting hungry right now. And the Pollo Guisado, marinated chicken filling and a tomato base. Just this really interesting, unique food, and it's a cool specialty for this restaurant.
What I really loved about learning about this new restaurant is the family connection and the love for family, using recipes from the family, bringing his son in to work at the restaurant. I love this idea of a local restaurant with family ties, and just it seems like there's a lot of love behind it, which is really sweet.
Yeah, it's a feel good story. Kennedy is also a former Brookline resident, not anymore, but yeah, it really made me want to check it out, and I think it's a really unique addition and offering in Brookline's restaurant scene.
Well, great. So we're going to go out right now. We tried matcha a couple weeks ago. Now we're going to go have some empanadas, I think. It's right around the corner, so we can do that.
Sounds great. Thanks everyone for listening. And just a reminder, if you want to check us out online, visit www.brookline.news, where you can read all these stories and more, sign up for our newsletter, and all the rest. See you next time.